This is Hindol Sengupta. Cohen joins me from California today. He's an old friend of mine and also used to be the Bush administration. David, welcome.
Oh, thank you. Great to be with you, Hindol.
I asked David to join me to give us a perspective of what's really going on in the US elections, what's happening in the U.S. Opinion making, so to speak, about the war in Gaza and now, of course, in Lebanon. How do people there see this? And of course, David is, of Jewish origin and married to an Indian, so he really has, should I say, multiple perspectives. He's of course American. He has a Jewish point of view. And of course, he understands what's happening in diaspora politics, which is of interest to us. David, thank you very much for sharing time. I want to begin by asking you, talk to us a little bit about, in India, for instance, there's a lot of interest about who's going to be the next president, because a lot of people believe that the future of Indo-US ties in the remaining years of Prime Minister Narendra Modi really vary depending on whether Kamala Harris or Donald Trump comes to power.
Yeah, I think that could be the case. I think Trump is more likely to be a kindred spirit with Prime Minister Modi. I think Modi's very skillful on the international stage. I think he'll get along with whoever gets elected. And I think he's very personable when he interacts with world leaders. But I think Kamala Harris may be more likely to have a sympathetic ear to Modi's critics and, be more susceptible to some of the narratives about, Hindu nationalism and discrimination against minorities that are sometimes propagated. And I think Donald Trump will have a better understanding of the difficult issues that Prime Minister Modi has to deal with. So I think that would be a better match, but we'll see.
One of the most incredible things, at least to audiences around the world, Global Order has an audience in 130 countries. Many people around the world, David, are astonished that up to 3 assassination attempts in some format or the other seems to have happened to Donald Trump. One, of course, is the one where the bullet whizzed by his ear and actually grazed one of his ears. And there have been others which have been, contained and caught before they actually took place. Now, this is incredible. If this would have happened in any other country, there would have been a lot of talk about democratic backsliding, tribalism, a breakdown of democratic norms, and all kinds of things. That this is happening in the US really shocks a lot of people around the world.
Yeah, it shocked a lot of us here in the U.S. As well. And just the gross incompetence that the Secret Service exhibited, at least certain parts of the Secret Service, specifically the leadership, exhibited, especially with the Butler assassination, and then in the aftermath of the Butler assassination, and in the aftermath of revelations that there was an Iranian plot to try to assassinate President Trump, because of course they would much prefer Kamala Harris be elected than Donald Trump be elected. Additional attempts on Mr. Trump's life were able to get as far as they did.
In our opinion, David, what's really going on, has the, in a sense, the political tribalism that has built up in American society over the last decade or more come to us a sort of boiling point, because a lot of people actually now cannot even stand the idea of political, ideological rival, in a sense, even being alive.
Yeah, I like your word, polemical tribalism, because that's exactly what it is. We have gotten more and more divided. It's been exacerbated by things like social media, and also beyond social media, just I guess the technological ability that we have nowadays to avoid viewpoints that we don't agree with. Um, it's always been more on the Democratic side, with the mainstream media leaning liberal. It's always been easier for people on the liberal side to avoid points of view that they don't agree with. And conservatives tended to be subject to and more familiar with what liberals thought than vice versa. But still, the increasing fragmentation of where their news, especially on social media, enables both sides to be in their own echo chamber, and that's not healthy.
David, for instance, if Trump comes to power once again, do you think this tribalism could actually prevent him from governing effectively? Because that's a big danger. A lot of people are talking about that. Will the sort of quote unquote the administrative state, as it were, some of which is in a sense controlled by Democratic sympathizers, even allow a Trump administration to roll out their policies effectively? Are these fears and doubts overstated? Can they actually be genuine?
I think the fears and doubts are genuine, and a lot of that happened last time as well. Uh, there's the phenomenon of lawfare where people are using the judicial system, sometimes through criminal prosecutions and sometimes through civil actions, to exact vengeance on their political opponents. And I think that's that's a very difficult situation. Of course, supporters of former President Trump believe, I think, with a good deal of merit, that the lawfare, the weaponizing of the justice system to attack political opponents, specifically former President Trump, is behind all of his legal troubles now, or at least most of them. And of course, on the other side, you will always say no one is above the law, but no one is beneath it either. And I think it's a very dangerous precedent if you have these dubious prosecutions being conducted, arguably for the purpose of achieving political ends.
Yes, of course, others would point out, David, that if Mr. Trump loses, there could be another scenario of the kind of raiding of Capitol Hill that we saw even as he was leaving office last time. So, in a sense, that tribalism could have a flip side too.
Yeah, I mean, division works both ways, and it's not healthy. And I think sort of a broad national consensus around the center has been undermined by the fact that the institutions that you need to achieve that type of consensus, among them a largely impartial media. Of course, the media has never been impartial, but on the other hand, it's never been as activist as it is today. I think that pretty much destroys the opportunity to have the country come together in some sort of consensus. We can't agree on what the facts are, and therefore we can't agree on what to do. And therefore, the only thing to do is to fight each other, and whoever wins gets to try to impose their will against the heavy opposition of whoever lost. So that's not the healthiest situation to be in.
Let me ask you, David, it keeps coming up, and now, of course, it's actually come up in the mainstream. People talk about the American deep state, so to speak. It's heard in many contexts around the world, but particularly in the context of this election, people have all kinds of conspiracy theories about the deep state. But in fact, the deep state in many cases is essentially the sort of, bureaucratic machinery which sort of lives from administration to administration. And the fear in America that many people have outside America is that like you were saying, like the mainstream media, that bureaucratic machinery has an ideological bent. Now, that bent, if the sort of political leaders who are elected don't follow that path, there is an inevitable and extremely volatile crash or clash. Would you agree that there is a certain sense of this administrative deep state?
Yeah, the deep state definitely exists. I mean, that's a label, so it would get derided by one side of saying, oh wow, conspiracy theories, and people are afraid of these dark shadowy operatives that don't really exist. But it's really, from the other side, it's just a term to describe uh, bureaucrats who are not elected and are generally immune from accountability, being able to exercise more power than would be prudent for unelected bureaucrats to exercise in a democratic system, and that is an issue. I remember when I was a political appointee in the administration of George W. Bush, the people that the president brings in his team. um, I learned about a phenomenon called burrowing, and that's where political appointees from the previous administration get civil service jobs, and therefore, rather than being sort of temporary instruments of the sitting president, which is the idea, they end up staying and becoming part of the permanent state. Now, Democrats are more likely to burrow than Republicans for a number of reasons. Republicans generally come from the private sector. They want to go back to the private sector. But there's definitely a problem with people who come in as activists for one political agenda, staying on as the supposedly neutral civil service.
Other question that I must ask, therefore, David, is that essentially what you're saying is that the deep state is not some, dark, sinister, sort of mythical thing. It is essentially is a sort of, permanent bureaucracy, which over time has become more and more ideological and ideologically aligned, and therefore it could be in opposition with political leadership who are elected. Now, what do you think could be a potential clash like this with this bureaucracy in a potential second term of Mr. Trump?
Well, if Mr. Trump gets elected again, um, hopefully he will go after the permanent bureaucracy. I mean, I think that's a reform we very much need to do. Of course, one of the people that has Mr. Trump's ear is Vivek Ramaswamy, of course, an Indian American. I'm sorry.
We talks about this all the time.
Oh yeah, and he, of course, and he's been focused on this, on the need to remove or reform, some of the civil service protections. We need civil service protections. We don't, I think it's important that the entire government not have to bend to the will of the changing administrations from time to time. But it can't get to the point where the unelected bureaucrats are actively subverting legitimate policy initiatives that are being pursued by the administration that was elected to pursue those initiatives. And that's what happens too often. And as a former political appointee, I had a pretty good staff, but you always have to be on the lookout for people who are trying to get in your way because they disagree with your politics, even though your politics is the one that won the elections. And that's what we always have to remember.
Put this in what we're going to discuss now, David, which is the impact of the war in Gaza and now Lebanon in U.S. politics. U.S. politics for a long time has had this conversation about whether the Israel lobby, so to speak, in the U.S. is strong, and what impact it has. But now, for the first time, in a sense, we are seeing a different kind of lobby, a huge Palestinian lobby, which is not just lobbying, which is taking over entire cities and towns and in mass protests. And this has become extremely volatile, so much so that anti-Semitic incidents in the US are hitting new highs. In many places, including college campuses, which ought to be safe for all students, are no longer so. I mean, in my own alma mater at Columbia University, there's been a lot of turbulence, and the president quit, and the turbulence continues. This seems to have become a whole new beast, David. Talk to us about how you see it.
Yeah, it's quite a situation. And I know you were using the term Israel lobby in implied scare quotes, but it is, people who oppose Israel have often, built up, the quote unquote Israel lobby or APAC as some sort of, mythical dark creature, and they use all the tropes that people have traditionally used against Jews to describe the quote unquote Israel lobby. But APAC is not an instrument of the Israeli government, but it is Americans who support our strong relationship with Israel, as we very much should, as it is our most important strategic ally in the Middle East. It is the strongest bulwark against the spread of Islamism that's destabilizing the region, led by the Islamic Republic that is currently in power in Iran. And I distinguish between the Islamic Republic and Iran. But meanwhile, any spending by the Americans, who fund APAC, has been dwarfed by the massive spending that the Qataris, for example, just one example, although that's the primary example, has spent not only in making inroads directly in politics, and they've certainly done that, but also in capturing institutions, first and foremost, universities, who, of course, are always looking for sources of money, and the Qataris have been more than willing to fund it. There are reports that they've been funding some of these protests directly, along with the Islamic Republic regime in Iran. So this explosion of anti-Semitism that we're seeing across the nation is essentially being funded from overseas. And of course, they've been developing the seeds of this for decades. But the direct funding, a lot of it is coming apparently from overseas. And that is something that our government needs to get a handle on. A lot of Jews, as you know, Jews traditionally vote for the Democrats, and there are a lot of reasons for that. I've been a Republican. I used to be a Democrat myself, but I've been a Republican for a number of years now. But I understand why Jews have traditionally voted Democrat. But since October 7th, there's been a growing awareness among Jews that, number one, the people that we as Jews have supported do not support us, and have fallen victims to some of the propaganda campaigns that have been used to demonize and dehumanize us. And number two, that there are some very problematic people serving in the current administration with a history of anti-Semitism and demonization of Israel that cause some real problems. So I think a lot of Jews are looking at this, and you're going to see a record number of Jews vote for Trump this year, because they realize on two fronts the anti-Semitism that we're facing here. And a lot of the pro-Palestinian protests, obviously, one can support the Palestinian people, one can support, whatever politics they want to support in the Middle East and anywhere else. But the pro-Palestinian protest almost without fail devolve into anti-Semitism, into demonization of Israel and Zionism. Of course, they've made Zionism a dirty word and have, usurped the definition of Zionism to mean every bad thing that anyone could attribute to their worst enemy. Apartheid, colonialism, genocide. Every dirty word. That's all Zionism, according to the people that who are activists in this movement, and that has the effect of demonizing Israel, demonizing Zionists. 95% of Jews are Zionists, and inevitably demonizing Jews. So we're looking at this situation, and also we do care about Israel, not only because we're Jewish, but because it is such an important strategic ally standing against what Iran is trying, I'm sorry, the Islamic Republic based in Iran is trying to do in the region. And they see how Trump would respond to this based on his record and also his statements. He would deport protesters who were deportable. He would crack down on protesters who commit illegal acts, even if they're not deportable. He would let Israel win, which is something the Biden administration seems to be allergic to. And it seems to be terrified to confront Iran at the very moment when Iran needs to be confronted before they become a nuclear power, not after. And they look at how Trump would conduct in this situation versus how Biden has, and many feel that Kamala Harris would be even worse, and that she's clearly over her head. And you're going to see a record number of Jews vote for Trump, even though that goes so much against what Jews have done politically for decades and decades.
I want to ask you, David, one of the questions that has arisen in this entire debate is how long will America still continue to fund and provide weapons to Israel? Now, this has been a question across the world. Macron is saying that he will stop weapon sales to Israel. In the UK, there's pressure. Inside America, there are groups like this infamous Squad, for instance, of this group of Rashida Tlaib and others, who are pushing, American politicians to stop arming Israel. Now, this seems completely against everything that we have known about this relationship in the past. And even Kamala Harris, when asked directly about weapon sales and support for Israel, many people thought that she gave a slightly evasive answer, and people believe increasingly that the kind of support Israel needs to survive as a nation state might not be forthcoming in the future from a Harris administration. Do you think this is overstated, or do you think these fears are genuine?
I think these fears are genuine. I share those fears. I don't know what Harris believes in her heart. I don't think she knows what she believes in her heart. But she is alarmingly susceptible to the types of superficial arguments that are used by people who do not want to see Israel exist. The arguments that they use to justify reducing U.S. support for Israel. And I think that would be bad for Israel, but Israel will find a way with or without U.S. support. And that's something that Israel's critics don't really understand. The U.S. only supplies a small percentage of Israel's military budget, much lower than what Israel's critics seem to think. And that will be a shame, but it would be a shame for the United States of America because a world with an ascendant Islamic regime in Iran and the inroads it's made in Lebanon, in Syria, in Iraq, of course, with Hamas and uh, all over the Middle East has really destabilized the region, and it is the direct uh, opponent of people who want to see a reformed, bright future for the Middle East, such as the leadership of the United Arab Emirates, which is a very forward-thinking leadership that can imagine a prosperous future for the Middle East, which of course we all know is impossible as long as it's being brought down by the Islamism of the Islamic regime, of the Muslim Brotherhood, and others who don't want peace, who want to reestablish a caliphate and expand it, and who want to threaten the rest of the world.
This context, David, one must talk about the sort of public square and the debates in the public square. For the longest time, America was one place where ideas like what Zionism really is, which is basically just a Jewish desire to have a homeland for Jews. Ideas like, why the phrase from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, is problematic because it talks about the extermination, in a sense, of the Jewish state. And all of this was widely understood. Also, the history was slightly better known. In 2005, Israel pulled out from the entire, area which is under debate, and yet, the Palestinians under the leadership of Hamas built those tunnels, and the battle continued. Now, all of this was better known. Public square has really moved in America, and perhaps you could talk to us a little bit about why that has happened, including Ta-Nehisi Coates, the popular nonfiction writer, seems to have spent only 10 days in Israel and came back with a very strange idea of a very, very complicated, complex history. And when challenged, many of his supporters seem to have suggested that even to challenge his views is racism. Outside America, many of us don't even understand how, in a country like America, so aware of history, things could get so skewed.
Well, you say America is so aware of history. I think, and I know you spent a lot of time here and are very familiar with our society, but I think you're being extremely generous about American knowledge of history. If I may, as an American, I think as a people, we're pretty ignorant. And I love our country. I love America. I love Americans. So, this criticism is made lovingly and not out of any sort of antipathy. But I think it's, especially in the TikTok generation, it's pretty easy to sway things with false narratives. And if I may, I'd really like to talk about this Ta-Nehisi Coates situation, uh, because you say he spent 10 days there and came away with a very strange conclusion. I would say he arrived there with a very strange conclusion, and then he used his 10 days to try to confirm his priors, as we say. Um, I was being a smart aleck on Twitter, sorry, on X, as we call it now. I said Ta-Nehisi Coates is a white savior. Now, I don't know if the word white savior is used a lot in India or outside the United States. I know you know what it is, but just for anyone in your audience that may not be familiar with it, white savior is a kind of joking term we use to describe mostly white Western people who are attracted to social justice, quote unquote, causes, who like to fight on behalf of what they see as poor, oppressed, downtrodden brown people, and but because they're narcissists, they don't really care about the people that they're fighting for. They don't care about whether the things they're advocating are really helping those people. What they care about is the feeling of being heroic and the importance of being seen as being heroic. And that's sort of what we call white saviors. So I tweeted that Ta-Nehisi Coates is a white savior, and that he may not be technically white, but he might as well be, especially in the context of this Israel-Palestine conflict. He sticks his nose into a conflict that he really doesn't know anything about. He can't be bothered to do his homework, but that doesn't stop him from expressing the most strident opinions with such certitude and confidence that you really have to admire it. And he takes his own cultural framework, based on his own personal experience, and insists on imposing that on a situation thousands of miles away from where he grew up, where his cultural framework is completely irrelevant. So in that sense, he's indistinguishable from a white savior. But the thing about Ta-Nehisi Coates' central premise, and maybe I should have backed up and said that, he said he learned from his father. Watching the news about conflict in Israel, what he learned from his father, who, by the way, was an anti-Semite, that the Jews are the white people and the Palestinians are the black people. So, in other words, you can understand Israel-Palestine just by relating it to America's long legacy and struggles with racism. And that part really got to me, because I think if you're going to analogize Israel-Palestine to the racial history of America, that they have it backwards. That, and if I may, let me explain. And by the way, I'm not just saying this to sort of be clever, reversing the tables on Ta-Nehisi Coates. I'm saying this because the point I'm about to make, I think, is the key to understanding the conflict in Israel-Palestine. It's the key that people miss. And I really appreciate the opportunity to explain it. And I start with the question: why, after the Civil War, and I know you're familiar with American history because you come from a country where people actually learn the history of other nations, perhaps unlike America. But after the Civil War, as you well know, whites in the South, developed, well, not that they developed, they had a psychotic hatred of newly emancipated blacks, and there are things that contribute to that. Not that they were in any way justified, but there were, explainers for why supremacists would react that way. And they hated blacks more than they hated the Northerners, the Yankees, the Union Army that had just defeated them in war, that had just conquered their territory. So I ask, why did Southern whites during the Jim Crow era, after the Civil War, hate blacks more than they hated the Northerners that defeated them? And what I suggest is that it's for the same reason that Arabs, and I'm not trying to be disparaging, but this is a sort of historical issue, that Arabs have hated Jews much more than they hated the British who actually colonized them, the French who actually colonized them. So why is that? And this is what I firmly believe, and this is what is the key to understanding Israel Palestine. That in the supremacist mind, when you have developed a sense of entitlement over generations and generations to treat another people as beneath you, whether as slaves or as the second class, what they call dhimmis, that Jews were throughout the Arab and Muslim years for over throughout the Arab and Muslim world for over a millennium. That once that previously enslaved or subjugated group gains any sort of power, it's deemed to be a humiliation, and the intensity of hatred and resentment that develops against those people, people you think you are entitled to be superior to, is just something most people who are not supremacists cannot understand. And of course, slavery and later Jim Crow is supremacism, just as the subjugation of Jews and other minorities in the Arab and Muslim world for 1400 years is supremacism. And that is the key to understanding the Middle East conflict, specifically Israel Palestine. Because from the start, Israel would have preferred to have all of the land from the river to the sea as a Jewish homeland, because in the mind of the Zionists, which I'm proudly one, in the mind of the Zionists, 78% of Palestine was already given to the Arabs when the British gave Abdullah, their non-Palestinian ally from Arabia, what is the land that is now Jordan. So they just gave 78% of Palestine to a non-Palestinian Arab monarchy. So the Jews thought that they would get the rest. But the Jews and the Zionists have always been willing to share the remaining land from the river to the sea in exchange for peace. But on the Palestinian side, they've rejected time after time, from the 1930s to the UN partition in the 1940s to several times after Israel was formed. They have always rejected the very idea that Jews would control even an inch of the Middle East. That is deemed a humiliation, similar to in the Old South during the Reconstruction era. In the South, they started electing Hiram Rebels was the first African American elected to the United States Senate. He was elected to Jefferson Davis's old seat in Mississippi. But boy, that was in Reconstruction. That was deemed to be a humiliation. Blanche Booker, later elected to the Senate, another African American man, even though the name is Blanche, elected for Mississippi. A number of members of Congress were elected who were African American, were elected to Congress and in state delegations. And then, as soon as things got back to quote unquote normal, the Union Army withdrew. That's when you had the KKK arise. That's when you had the Jim Crow laws arise that said, no, the whites said, no, we are not going to accept this. These people are beneath us. We don't care what the Constitution says. We are going to put these people, quote unquote, in their place. So you had the extreme violence of the KKK where people were lynched. It's very similar. So the KKK arose in response to Black enfranchisement, just as the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, arose in response to Zionism, which was the enfranchisement and empowerment of the Jewish people. And the level of violence, the sadism, the cruelty, like you saw on October 7th, that's been a feature of this from the start. And that is the mentality that says, no, we are in Israel, Palestine, where they say, no, we are not going to share this land with you. We're going to use any control over any part of the land we have to drive you out of the rest of the land. You know, Arabs controlled the West Bank and Gaza after Israel's War of Independence, and they controlled it for almost 2 decades. But there was never any effort to create a Palestinian state there, although nothing would have stopped them. The PLO was formed when Arabs controlled the West Bank and Gaza. But the PLO said, we don't want the West Bank and Gaza. We want to, quote unquote, liberate where the Jews live. And that has always been the aim, and it is rooted in supremacism. It is not rooted in trying to get a Palestinian state. It is rooted in the idea that it is an abomination that the lowly Jews, the dhimmi Jews, the Jews that used to have submissive posture to us for over 1,000 years, the Jews that we used to be able to bully around and boss around, that those people would have any sovereignty over even an inch of the Middle East, the region that the supremacists think is theirs and theirs because they invaded it and they conquered it and they exterminated or subjugated all the indigenous peoples throughout the Middle East, from Arabia all the way up to Iraq and even Iran, which was never Arabized, but all the way across North Africa, 5,000 miles away to Morocco and Mauritania. It is the largest settler colonial project in the world. It is the worst place in the world to be a minority. It is the only place in the world where blacks are still owned as slaves and called slaves. You know, they're called abid. That's the term for slave all across the region. That is the supremacist mentality that prevents Israel-Palestine from being resolved peacefully with territorial compromise. And that explains, people say that the occupation causes terrorism, but it's the other way around, because the terrorism and the constant attempts to destroy Israel that arise from Gaza and the West Bank require Israel to take security measures to prevent that from happening. And sometimes people, white saviors in the West, don't understand the context of why Israel is forced to take measures to protect itself, because they don't know what it means to live next door to extremists. I think people in India have a much better understanding of what it's like to live next door to extremists. Fortunately, India has a lot more space to work with and a lot bigger population to work with, but that doesn't mean that India hasn't always been vulnerable to the type of terrorist extremism that it's repeatedly been subject to from people who want to attack India simply because they are supremacists who don't want to see a multicultural democracy like India exist. So those are my.
Let's talk a little bit about India then as we wrap up this conversation, David. Many people get this feeling, especially after the war in Gaza, that in the minds of many hardline, hard left activists, including academics in the West, Indians have become, in a sense, Israeli adjacent, so to speak. They are the next big target. And many of the things that you're talking about, it sort of adds up, because even though India was colonized, by, Muslim invaders for a long, long time, and of course, then with British colonialists and so on and so forth, the narrative is all about how supposedly India's majority community, the Hindus, are sort of, colonizing everyone else. And now, of course, there is this whole thing that, oh, well, India supports Israel, even though India has always really, and even today, maintains that it really promotes the two nation theory. But of course, there's this whole idea that is spread. And the next legitimate target after Jews in the West, at least that's how many Indians see it, have become Indians, and specifically Indian Hindus. What's really going on, do you think?
Well, I think you identified that perfectly. And I think both of us have always recognized the natural alliance between Indians and Israelis, between Jews and Hindus and others in India who want to fight for, the type of society that India has built there, in contrast to the more monochrome, as I say to be polite, society that you have in Pakistan. And it's very much a similar dynamic. I mean, you had a similar dynamic during the partition, and I know that I think your family's from Bengal, was really on the front lines of a lot of the horrors that occurred during the partition. But the whole idea of compromise. What happened in the partition? You had several million Hindus, Sikhs, and others were displaced in the name of establishing a Muslim state. But that was a compromise accepted by the majority Hindus, some very reluctantly, and for understandable reasons. But it was a compromise. And 77 years after the partition of India, you don't have all the Hindus and Sikhs who were pushed out of the lands they had lived since ancient times, considering they don't consider themselves refugees. They don't say that, oh, we have a right of return. Let's move back to Pakistan. Let's move back to the cradle of Hindu civilization, in the Indus Valley that is now in Pakistan. No, they've moved on. They've accepted the compromise. And for all the horrible things that happened as a result of the partition, at least it create, there's stability after it. I know there are wars, but it's not like what you have in Israel Palestine, where the division of the land was never accepted, and the Palestinians still consider themselves refugees, and they still intend to ethnically cleanse the Jews and drive them to the sea. That. So there's similarities, and the similarities are instructive in letting us see how the parties reacted so differently. In India, at least, there was a reasonableness in the moving on, which has never occurred in Israel Palestine. But India is certainly on the front lines of the war on terror. We mark the anniversary of the horrific attacks in Mumbai, every year, and the plight of the Kashmiri Hindus who were ethnically cleansed in their own country. So people who have been dealing with those horrific situations have a better understanding of what the Jews and Israelis are going through, and from the Jewish side, we very much appreciate the people in India, and from the Hindu community and the Sikh community and so many other communities who have a much better understanding than the average white savior does of what Israel has to do to protect itself. Israel, people call Israel colonists, and they're the oppressor, which is nonsense. Israel is the tiny sanctuary where, that was found by the Jews from all over the Middle East and North Africa. That's the majority of Jews in Israel. They're the grandchildren or great grandchildren or more of people who were chased out of Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, Egypt, Yemen, Lebanon, Syria, all those places, just because they were Jews. They were collectively punished. A lot of this happened after Israel was formed, and then the supremacist majority said, "Well, we're mad at you, Jews, a helpless, tiny, powerless minority." So they took it out on them because, of course, collective punishment is a war crime when you can try to accuse Israel of it, which is nonsense. But apparently, collective punishment is okay when you want to do it against the Jews. So these are the guys that were oppressed. These are the guys who had to flee for their lives, and they found sanctuary in Israel. It's the only place in their indigenous region where they can live freely. And I think a lot of people in India understand that, and that's why there's sort of a natural friendship that, from my perspective, is so appreciated.
Last question for you, and this comes from what we were discussing about Ta-Nehisi's quotes, cut and paste ideological frameworks, right? Ta-Nehisi quote seems to have gone to Israel with this idea that Israelis were the white oppressors and the Palestinians were the sort of quote unquote the sort of oppressed and slaves and so on and so forth. Now, in this framework, this is being cut and pasted to many societies, including to India, wherein in India's context, I'm thinking of this book called called Caste that was written a couple of years ago. The framework gets copy pasted where Hindus become the white oppressors and everybody else is being oppressed. Whereas, funnily enough, in the 1,000 or 1,500 year history of India, for most parts, it was the Hindus who were oppressed. Now, but this is particularly insidious. If this was only happening at a conversational level, one could laugh it off. But this is actually being taught to students in major academic centers around the world, in Ivy League colleges, in Oxbridge, and so on and so forth. Whereas this entire framework, and now there's legislation based on this in various parts of the world that has been pushed, including in America. In California, there's been a lot of effort, and there's a lot of pushback also from the diaspora communities. But the effort is continuous because exactly the same framework is being cut and pasted with very little understanding of India's indigenous history.
Yeah, and I think one of the biggest threats to the world are Hindu white oppressors from India, right? I mean, of course, I'm joking, but you're right. It is something that is something to laugh at if the consequences weren't so serious. And that's another thing that I think Indians and particularly the Hindu community have, in common with Israelis and Jews, is that some of the propaganda narratives that are used against us are so ridiculous, and yet we watch in amazement as they gain traction, and that people actually believe them, even if they're internally contradictory. And we say, what's going on? I think if you believe things that are so illogical, it's not because you're convinced, or perhaps it's because you want to hate on those people, be they Hindus or Jews or Indians or Israelis. So I think that is something, and I think that these narratives that are being propagated against Hindus in particular, I think have a similar genesis to the anti-Israel narratives. A lot of people don't know, but this whole notion of Israelis as white European colonialists, the settler colonialist, apartheid, ethnic cleansing, these narratives, which are easily demolished by anyone who actually knows the history, but a lot of these were formulated um, in the Soviet Union in the 1960s. And it sounds like a big conspiracy theory, but it is relevant to India as well, because the Soviets used this narrative as a way of per, uh, pursuing their own foreign policy objectives and to gain power and influence throughout the what they called the third world at the time at the expense of the United States. And they invested heavily in creating this narrative, which only arose in the 1960s, that demonized Israel, demonized Zionism. That's when they started to make Zionism a dirty word. And it was so successfully propagated throughout the Western leftist ecosystem by the Soviets that these narratives and this propaganda campaign has outlived the Soviet Union itself by several decades now. And throughout the left in the West, people have been socialized with this narrative about Israel. And it is a very easy next step then to start defining people other people you don't like, or other people who may be a threat to your own power and influence, as Israel adjacent. Just like people of color in the United States who don't go along with the woke agenda, they're called white adjacent. No matter how dark they actually are, well, they're white adjacent. So this adjacency stuff is a way of importing a BS narrative that was developed by someone else to just use it ready-made. By the way, it also applies every nasty thing we said about Jews, and of course they won't say Jews, they'll say Zionists, is the same thing. It applies equally to the Hindu nationalists. As they'll say, they have to have a pejorative term to demonize people they don't like with. So yeah, it's get used to it. I know Hindus in India are have been suffering from the exact same thing from time immemorial. But yes, we're going to see more and more of it in the West, and Hindus are going to continue to be targets unless we all stand together to fight back. And that's what we have to do. I think that's what we've been doing, and we're going to have to continue doing that.
Fascinating. I'm really glad that this, what really began as a conversation about American politics, really allowed us to get into a lot of detail, which is really, really interesting, and I dare say would be interesting to many viewers. Thank you very much for taking time off to get into all these details with me. No doubt there will be other opportunities as all of these stories, in a sense, progress and become, in a sense, more complicated in the years and months to come. There will be other instances to discuss this in more detail with you. Thanks very much, David Cohen, joining me today from California to discuss this. Thanks for your time.
Thank you. As always, I've really enjoyed talking to you, and really appreciate the opportunity to share ideas with you, which is always stimulating and a wonderful experience.
Thank you, David. Appreciate it once again. Thank you.